healthy, staying healthy, managing well, you and your loved one during these times of uncertainty and the health challenges that are affecting all of us around the globe. So today we are fortunate at MEI to have an outstanding panel of Iraqi experts who come from diverse sectors and experiences, who will discuss the myriad political, socioeconomic, and security challenges facing Iraq amid the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. I mean, the pandemic could not have hit Iraq at the worst time. As many of us said, Iraq is now facing a perfect storm. Not only are they dealing with the health crisis, they have been dealing for some time now with a political crisis. They have been now, as recently, more decline in oil prices, which affects the livelihood of millions of Iraqis, including public sector employees and business owners, small business owners. There are increasing U.S Iran tension that are playing out on Iraqi territory. And then we have still a country that has a caretaker government, but has been finding, political elites have been finding trouble or difficulties in somehow helping with a new government formation since the resignation of Dr. Adel Abdul-Mahdi in November 2019. Now, while social distancing and all other measures to prevent the spread of the virus have forced the protesters to put a halt on their movement, the structural factors in Iraq that led them into the streets day after day since October 2019 remain. Their anger and opposition to the ways the political system works, ruling elites run the country, are likely exacerbated by scenes in Baghdad of few men meeting in back rooms to hammer out deals about who's going to be the next prime minister. Now, since November 2019, there have been 3 prime minister designates, Dr. Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi, Mr. Adnan Al-Zurfi, both of whom failed at forming a government and resigned their appointments. On April 9, President Barham Saleh appointed Mr. Mustafa Al-Kadhimi for the job. He has 30 days to form a government. There are reports today that he might be, very close to forming the government. There have been different, rumors spreading, reports spreading about who is going to be in the government. But I'm hoping that our panel will address some of these questions and talk also about the challenges facing him in this task. So as I said, we have a stellar panel of experts today with us, 3 of whom are based in Baghdad. So in case there is some technical difficulties because of internet connection, I want our audience to know that, and hopefully everybody will be joining us through video, but also if video does not work, we might have always the audio function. So let me start by introducing them. Mr. Farhad Al-Alauddin, chairman of the Iraq Advisory Council, who served as a political advisor to President of Iraq, Barham Saleh, from October 2018 until March 2019, and also served as political advisor to former President of Iraq, Dr. Fuad Masoom, from July 2014 to October 2018. Many of you in the audience know him well, and he is well known as a writer, also as a commentator on Iraq KRG affairs. Second, I would like to welcome Ms. Hafsa Halawa. Hafsa is an independent consultant working on political, social, and economic affairs and development goals in the MENA region. A former corporate lawyer. There is hope with lawyers then, guys, if Hafsa now is working on development issues. So there are hopes for other lawyers, join the crowd, work on development issues. So a former corporate lawyer, she has held positions in government, NGOs, corporate, multinational, and think tanks. We are fortunate to have Hafsa as a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. I would also like to welcome Mr. Yasser Al-Maliki. Currently, he is the managing director of the Iraq Energy Institute in Baghdad, where he leads research programs on Iraq and Kurdistani oil, natural gas and power sectors, water and environmental challenges, and the economy. We also are fortunate at MEI to have Yasser as a non-resident scholar with us. Lastly, but not least, is my good friend, Dr. Muhammad Radi Al-Shumari, a professor of political science at Al-Nahrain University since 2006. And since 2017, he has worked as head of Foreign Relations Office at the Hikmah National Movement. Now, although this is a virtual meeting, my objective is to make this 1 hour as interactive, excuse me, as possible. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature. You can all see on the bottom of your screen. For those calling in by phone or watching the panel on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with hashtag MEI events, or you can email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. With the, and please feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I will be reviewing these questions as they are appearing on my screen, and will try as best as possible to fold them into the discussions with the panelists. Now, with that, let us get started. And with the first issue, which is on the mind of many Iraq observers and analysts, with Kak Farhad, if you can help us just understand why Mr. Al-Kadhimi was selected with the job. His name, after all, has been proposed a number of times, you know, for the position in the past. Why now? Is there an urgency of now somehow that prompted his selection? And importantly, what are his chances at getting the job done when two of his predecessors failed at that? And finally, what are the potential red flags we need to be looking for that can stall his momentum at forming the government? Kak Farhad, the floor is yours.
Hi, Randa. Hi, and hi for the audience. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Really, the optimist in me would say, yes, Mr. Kadhimi will make it, and he will form a new government pretty soon. I mean, the hope is that he will do it before the 23rd of April and the start of Ramadan. However, there are some real obstacles on the way, and there are people who could analyze and think he might not make it and be the same, face the same challenges as the previous two have faced. I would say that COVID and the difficulty of a meeting by the Council of Representatives is a challenge. However, to me, the biggest challenge would be the drivers of change has gone away in some extent, namely the protesters, and the pressure they used to apply to the political elite is a lot less. Imam Sistani used to call for change, and he has stopped all these calls directly, and the political elite might not feel the same pressure from him anymore. And really, when you analyze the political parties who are seeking change are very few and far in between. Many of them would see status quo is a good choice for them, given that whatever they need within the political system, so they don't see that any need for change as such. So if you go through, then you would say he's not going to make it. However, hearing closely from the camp of the Prime Minister designate, and from him personally, yesterday he met with an elite of journalists and analysts. He have made he have analyzed the situation as that he's hopeful, and he's optimistic that he's going to make it and form a government. It is a very difficult situation, and it could go either way. And it is I would say anybody's guess right now as what's going to happen, and only time will tell that we're going to see a change happening. Why him and not somebody else? That's really a very, I don't think the hour will be enough to go into details of what exactly took place. But I think that should be left to the history books rather than divulge into the subject at this moment. There are other things that maybe we should talk about rather than what happened and how we ended up with Mustafa Al-Kadhimi and not somebody else. So I would say I would leave it at that for the time being.
Thank you, Farhad. Mohammed, I want you to build on what Farhad says and focus on the, give us your perspective again, also on why Mr. Al-Kadhimi was selected, and how the decision, if it's possible, was made, and more importantly, focus on the militias, especially on the Iran-backed militias. Some of them have voiced opposition or strong reservation, if we can put it this way, to the appointment of Mr. Al-Kadhimi, and yet this happened. Does this mean they are less influential? Is fragmentation people are talking about affecting their leverage, inside Iraqi politics? And how do you see that? And how the pandemics is affecting their role in Iraqi politics now, and you think in the future?
Thank you. I think there is a reality in Iraq when it comes to choosing the prime minister. For last 16 years, we always have a prime minister as a result of a compromise in Iraq, whether among the internal players or the external players. This time, after the resignation of Dr. Adel Abdul-Mahdi, and which was combined with the escalation in conflict between the United States and Iran, there was a kind of attempt to impose some willings from this side or that side, to impose someone closer to them. It's different than all the previous experience of choosing the prime minister. So we witnessed the failure of nominating Mr. Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, Qusay al-Sihel, Asad al-Aidani, who considered as closer to one side, and also Mr. Adnan al-Zurfi, who considered is closer to the other side. So this game is not working in Iraq. When it to Mr. Kadhimi, who was a name that one of the two candidates in 2018 with Dr. Adel Abdul-Mahdi, there is a kind of wide respect to his name, his role from different players. But it wasn't about refusing him for himself, but wanting to have someone closer to this side or that side. After all the failure in choosing a new prime minister, the different players reached a reality that they need to return back to the compromise to choose the prime minister. So after rounds of dealing with names or nominating names, they reached finally to Mr. Kadhimi. I think he has very strong opportunity to make it. As Farhad said, there is a consensus in Iraq to support him, to vote for him. Yes, maybe there will be some, let's say, tricks from this side or that side, but finally he will make it, because there is a kind of will to go forward with him, even from some blocks that were stated with Mr. Adnan al-Zurfi. Regarding the militias, I think they will continue what they used to do. Yes, they refused him in the beginning, but the dynamics of Iraqi politics dominate I think, dominate the behavior of those groups. And finally, they will be with the Shia consensus in dealing with choosing the prime minister. They have kind of minimum requirements. They will deal with any new prime minister according to those requirements. But there is also another reality that most of them, they don't have representation in the parliament. So the political blocs, they have the will to vote to pass this government, maybe even with kind of objections from some groups.
So I have a question. As I said earlier in the introduction, I'm going to be folding questions throughout the conversation. So the question is addressed to you, Mohammed, and it has to do with the religious nature of some of the Shia parties, and whether do you believe that the religious nature is no longer an ideology, but just a front? And do you believe that Shia parties are becoming more political goals driven and less sectarian in terms of their orientation? If you can quickly address this question, please.
Yeah, I think the Shia political parties is in transformation process. They are more pragmatic. They are more adaptive with the needs of the streets. Yes, they have some principles, some ideological basis they base on, but they are more pragmatic now, and they are more political, more willing to deal with the variables, the realities in Iraq, than to use the ideology as a framework for their work. This is a process. It didn't come to its end. Maybe in 1 or 2 other terms, we will see more national parties than what we have now.
Okay. Again, building again on how the COVID is affecting the political situation, but also the current process of ongoing process of government formation. I mean, the big part of the equation is civil society, or the youth, people who are not represented necessarily by the leaders of these political blocs, who were absent from these backroom deals where negotiations take place to select the next prime minister. So Hafsa, I know you have been in conversation with some of the leaders of the protest movement, and I think our audience, I will be very interested in hearing what you are hearing from them about the current political situation, Mr. Al-Kadhimi, and where do you see this protest movement moving next?
Thank you, Randa, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with esteemed colleagues, and thank you to all those watching and engaging in the discussion. I think generally there is, I would say, consensus to accept the state of politics, the state of play that we've reached among, I would say, more civil society leaders, those with more longevity in the game, have been around and been active in their particular sectors, rather than the sort of organic protest movement that has been born with their support and with their expertise to help it along. Mustafa Al-Kadhimi has generally been a quite popular figure for several years, recent years. I don't believe that there's any real debate over him or his credentials. I think rather the issue is more that certainly the movement has, as Farhad said, lost its momentum, but that came long before COVID. That came long before the marches were suspended because of the virus, long before decisions were taken to change the nature and course. The movement has grown online. There is engagement. NGOs and civil society that were engaged in service delivery have moved to making masks, supporting through whatever PPE they can produce. So they're still finding their role to play in civil society, but rather the politics itself is going to shift, and it's going to shift more to acknowledgement and understanding of what genuine change means. We have to remember that Iraq's governance structure has effectively been stagnant since the 2018 elections. We spent months waiting for Adel Abdul-Mahdi to be appointed, and since then, governance has slowly stagnated as the parties, engage in tit for tat. Everything, the whole wheel, as you would like to call it, has just effectively stopped, and that, it's very prominent and felt outside of Baghdad. We also have to bear in mind that protests are not new to Iraq. This has been ongoing since 2011, even before. And of course, we remember the 2018 crisis that brought down Adel Abadi, the previous prime minister. So it is a case of acknowledging and understanding the grievances and having the genuine will to tackle them. And what we're seeing with the COVID response is there is a targeted attack on civil society that has been ongoing since the protest movement began, believed to be led by militia, by the militias, whether or not with government consent, we don't particularly know, although there is reports that the government have supported understanding more information about groups that are receiving foreign funding, for example, from the Americans and so forth, and targeting these offices and places of home, even for these civil society leaders. But what we're seeing now under COVID is a media crackdown, which is not unique to Iraq. It's commonplace that we're seeing across the MENA region. But, media transparency, government transparency in an age like this is not just a national obligation, it's a global responsibility. So these issues of civil society, we could see a massive backslide after the COVID pandemic, in the post-pandemic era with a new government. And it's a good idea for people to remember that the protesters are angry enough still to continue to hold whoever the new prime minister will be, likely Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, to account for that.
Thank you, Hafsa. Yasar, I think, the economic impact of COVID added to the crisis of the precipitous decline in oil price, makes the economic trajectory, at least in the short to medium term, of Iraq look very grim, to be very honest. Now, there has been recently a decision accepted by Iraq, by the OPEC Plus group of countries, to cut Iraq's oil production by 1 million barrels. And there has already recrimination from different sides of the political spectrum about why Iraq, given these economic challenges, has accepted this kind of cut and whether it can live with the cut or not. So just help us unpack about why Iraq went ahead with this. I mean, did it have a choice in a way? I mean, that's I think, one question. And where do you see the short-term economic scenarios of Iraq heading?
Well, thank you very much, Randa. And again, thank you also to your esteemed panelists and all those attending. Well, indeed, Iraq is going through a second double shock, economic one. The first being in 2014 with the rise of ISIS and the collapse of oil prices. Now it's more of the COVID-19 pandemic globally and its effect on Iraq, and also the greatest oil price decline in history. We have lost 50% of the oil price since the beginning of the year. And to those attending, they have to understand the effect on Iraq itself. Iraq depends on oil revenues. 99% of exports are oil, 60% contribution to GDP, and also more than 90% of state revenues come from oil. Unfortunately, non-oil income is still very meager, and we have problems with the public financial management system itself. To understand, Iraq had a windfall of almost 1 trillion from 2003 to 2018 and missed to use that amount to invest it in essential human capital and physical capital projects and divested it towards payroll and expanding public expenditure. And this is why we are vulnerable today. Now, going to the part where we speak of the OPEC Plus recent meeting, I truly believe that Iraq has been cornered again. to go with these cuts, same way it has been cornered back in 2016 when it needed international support to fight ISIS. There is a lost opportunity that Iraq has forgiven, being the grievances of the past. In the 90s, Iraq lost market share to other producers within OPEC. Also, it came from 3 wars, sanctions, and also it was fighting terrorism. Today, we are still vulnerable to these threats, and we have not used these reasons to get a better position, not necessarily an exemption, but a better position when it comes to our cuts. So today, Iraq is needed to cut 23% of its production. It has been set at 4.563 million barrels per day. Exports as of last month were 3.39 million barrels a day. If you take that into consideration, you are looking at around 750,000 barrels per day of exports to be cut. Putting that into money in terms of the oil price today, that is around 675 million barrels for May and June. You have to understand one thing. Iraq needs 6 billion to break even on its fiscal needs. We have lost almost 50% of that since the beginning of the year. We have been trying to model this at the Institute. We see at a price of $30 by the end of the year, Iraq is only getting 32 billion in revenues. That will not be enough to cover payroll, which is at 62 billion. Now we go to the decision-making part of this. Many here in Baghdad are starting to believe that the Minister of Oil has taken a unilateral decision of sorts by going into the meeting and signing on these cuts. What other participants had done before was going through a broad consultation with all those stakeholders involved in the oil industries and government. So for instance, there had been no prior, as far as we know, no prior consultation with the Economic Affairs Council of the Cabinet or the Energy Affairs Council, but rather it was done after signing up for the cuts. So this has left a bit of a problem, especially also that we have a key stakeholder that is the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is supposed to be included in these cuts and also has not been consulted before going into the OPEC Plus meeting. At the same time, we are looking at some lost opportunities from the meeting. As everybody knows, Washington is quite invested in this cut. There are around 10 million people working in the oil and gas industry in southern states and all over the United States. Also, oil is sold in dollars. And the Trump administration has been working tirelessly to see this deal coming. So Iraq could have used that to get some gains, like an extended waiver for gas imports from Iran, or even further IMF standby agreement or a new loan agreement. So these are some of the ideas that are floating around. One thing the next government might face is the fact that this current government has resigned, and all of these question marks on the decision making. Some people might feel they are not obliged in the future to continue signing up to this deal, and it also depends on how the oil prices are going to look in May and in June after the biggest part of the management, the supply management deal is going to be done.
Great, thank you. Now, this is a question that I'm going to address first to Hafsa, but then others, please feel free to join in. And it builds on a question that was asked by one member of the audience. It has to do with the impact of COVID on Iraq, on what other conflicts, you think are going to be deepened by COVID? What should be looking for? What has been the impact of COVID on vulnerable communities? I mean, in the United States, we have a lot of talk right now about the impact, the disproportionate impact of COVID on the African American community because of structural inequities in the healthcare system as well as the economic system in this country. So what has been the impact in Iraq on vulnerable communities, on women, on displaced, you have still millions of people displaced, on the poor, and then has that impact differed from one province to the other. I have seen a report of President Saleh addressing a letter of thanks. I forgot which provincial governor, thanking him for not having COVID in his province, right? I forgot, to be very honest, which province. So how's the impact has been among the different provinces, and are there these inequities among these provinces, especially that affects their abilities respectively to deal with the health challenges? So I'm going to start with Hafsa, and then I'm going to ask whoever would like to add to what Hafsa says, please feel free to do so. Hafsa.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. So in terms of the conflicts and the security landscape that we have, obviously, we've seen a slight resurgence, or when people are starting to call it a resurgence of ISIS in certain parts of the country. We're seeing it also in parts of Syria. But I would say the idea that ISIS will launch in the coming period, and there are security analysts that are better placed than me to speak to it, but to launch a territorial campaign to retake territory in the way that we saw in 2014, 13, 14 is, in my opinion, unlikely. What is probably more likely is that we'll see ISIS settle into a more comfortable low-level insurgency, similar to what we see in, say, Northern Sinai or other parts, whereby the attacks that we have seen continuously since 2016-17, when the liberations began, will continue, particularly in very vulnerable areas such as Kirkuk, Diyala, which have remained precarious and dangerous even before, since the war began, officially ended until now. I'm not as best placed as my colleagues to discuss the militias themselves or any deepening conflict. I would just caution that certainly the research that I've conducted over the last 2 to 3 years shows that there's a real decline amongst populations in all the provinces across the country towards buying into sectarian narratives. The real general feeling is that sectarianism, they're exhausted by sectarianism, and it's no longer any kind of driving force, although that should be caveated that we still see people voting in sectarian patterns, and whether that will change in the years to come owing to any shifts we see in governance, we can, that's a different debate to have. But in terms of vulnerable communities, not to rehash what we well know to be already the deficiencies towards the treatment of IDPs and the general status of IDPs in the liberated areas, the displaced areas. Of course, without a doubt, those provinces that have suffered under the war have had their medical facilities effectively wiped out. We've seen transition and displacement, and that's not just happened within the IDP community, it's happened within the professional community. So hospital workers, school teachers, all who worked in these cities before the war have been displaced along with IDP communities. They have in turn then been re-employed through either the international community and the support given through humanitarian funding, which has prevented return to the sort of major hotspot cities. And here I'm thinking about Sinjar, Hawija, and cities in Diyala and other parts of Anbar, for example, outside of maybe Fallujah and Ramadi. And what this effectively means is that the services there are very poor. Now, it's very difficult to gauge a COVID response in these areas because testing is by and large very, very low, particularly in these areas. We also know that many of the camps that service quote unquote ISIS women or ISIS children are at the basic level underserviced, let alone in the case of a pandemic such as this. So we understand that these communities, the vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled, have very little ability to access services, particularly those who live in rural areas, unable to access services that may only be in major cities in these poorest provinces that have year on year been ignored by the Iraqi budget set in Baghdad in comparison to some others. I don't have data on the provinces specifically and the COVID response, so I don't want to talk offhand about that. Maybe certainly further down the line with the response, I think we'll get more concrete evidence. But again, to reinforce, this is where the media, our journalists, international and local, are critical to being able, I have spoken to doctors on the front line who, particularly in Anbar province, who talk about, I think it's Anbar at least, a very stressed medical system in that particular area, but I don't want to talk too much without authority on the issue. Thank you.
Any of the panelists would like to add to the points that Hafsa just made? Also these questions about... Please, Farhad.
I make here is certainly real. However, right now their operations are pretty limited to what they do in the lines of that exist between the areas where the Peshmerga are guarding. On the other side are the Iraqi federal forces, and the gap between these two lines sometimes is wide, goes to up to 10 kilometers, and sometimes it's just a few hundred meters, and they are exploiting these gaps between the two lines, and with the little coordination that exists between the two forces that should be. Now they are exploiting these lines, and they conduct some operations. And the Iraqi forces have recently launched some cleaning and research and capture operations on this. However, it's only an indication that the threat is not at the longer term. With that.
There is a question that I think also maybe you can quickly address, which is, has the redeployment of US forces and drawdown of some of the numbers as well affected the Iraqis' forces' ability to fight ISIS? Has it created new opportunities for ISIS?
I didn't go as far as that, because basically the main thing here is not the US forces on the ground, rather than the cooperation and intelligence sharing and conducting operations together has more effect than actual boots on the ground. The Iraqis do have plenty of fighting force that they can deploy and fight on the ground. However, the coalition contribution is immensely important when it comes to intelligence sharing and logistics. So that need to continue really to have a chance to eradicate ISIS forever. But that part needs to be strengthened, and further collaboration is hugely important at this stage.
All right. Again, I'm trying to fold the question. There is a set of questions that have been posed by the audience on what do we expect Mr. Al-Kadhimi to do? You know, one, in terms of program, are we expecting him to announce early elections? Are you expecting him to include more women in the, I mean, Mr. Adel Abdul-Mahdi government did not include any women in the cabinet. Are you expecting him to include women? I mean, after all, Dr. Alawi, during his attempts at forming the government, promised 3 ministerial portfolios for women. Mr. Az-Zurfi promised to have a ministry of women and social affairs. Although I have to say, there was a Ministry of Women under Al-Maliki government, but I remember those days when I would go to meet, you know, the minister. Basically, the ministry did not get funding. So there is a ministry, but there was no funding for the ministry. Anyway, so what sectors do you expect Mr. Al-Kadhimi to focus on as he's facing the challenges of, you know, economic decline? And so this is a group of questions that have been now addressed, posed by the audience. Who would like to take a first crack at that? Yasar, tfaddal.
Thank you, Randa. So just a little correction. There is actually a minister in Abdul-Mahdi's cabinet who's a woman, I think the Minister of Education. Yes. But she has been added, I think, after resignation or a while before. So it got complicated a bit in those few weeks.
Complicated when it comes to women minister, always. We don't somewhere else. Okay, go ahead, Yasar.
Thank you. So just to have a look of you know, what should the next government be doing? Al-Kadhimi is most probably going to be the prime minister. He is the least controversial, if not even controversial figure. He has a good networking capacity. He has been forging good agreements and good connections with almost all the political, you know, elites and spheres and so on. In terms of economics, on the short term, really the government needs to focus on ensuring the availability of funds to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Although many of us are quite comfortable now in Iraq with a number of 1,400 to 1,500 cases, we still have not seen the worst part of this pandemic, and the infrastructure in place is highly questionable to handle a larger number. So this is the main focus of the government for the short term. That short term being 1 year, I'm thinking here. The second would be stabilizing the economy by making sure that we do fiscal consolidation. That means some very brave decisions, including ensuring the public wage payment, at least basic salaries, moderating the reserve withdrawals, foreign exchange reserves, increased local and international borrowing, reducing the operating budget, which is a big task to do. 75% of planning of a planned expenditures usually go to operating expenditures. Freeze payroll. This is something that has been done before in 2017, and it did help a lot. It was done through the consolidation practices with the IMF. Try to utilize the new pension law arrangement to unload some of the great numbers, the bloated numbers of the public wage. Although, unfortunately, last year we have seen the increase by 500,000 of direct and indirect, directly and indirectly paid wages through the government system, and that is a problem. Eventually, they also need to do something about capital spending. The government has been doing a traditional usage of funds to create projects, infrastructure projects, or even implementing them themselves. So that has to change somehow, but that is something for the midterm to long term. Also, the Kadhimi government needs to survive the socio-political impacts of such brave decisions, because there will be a big backlash and probably reigniting of protests. Unfortunately, with the protest movement in Iraq, there are two things that are missing. The movement is quite fragmented, and also there needs to be an understanding of the needs of the people. The 500,000 employees figure that I just put moments ago was mostly of protesters who would give their CVs, give a big list to the government at that time, because the government was under so much pressure, and then they would move them into the government payroll, and you know, they are pleased and they leave. So this is a problem. The protesters need to know what they want. Exactly, do they need change, or do they want a government job by the end of the day? And this is a big problem. If you allow me another half a minute, for the midterm and long term, what really Kadhimi government needs to focus on is defining the fiscal policy of Iraq. Iraq needs to have fiscal planning practices that go beyond 1 year. We have to think 3-year to 5-year plans. We have to stop the pro-cyclical spending of the government, which has to do with higher oil prices and so on. Also, we have to tighten the KPIs on current spending and so on, increase tax revenues, and build fiscal buffers like foreign exchange reserves and sovereign wealth funds. But of course, this will require lots of capacity building. This will require removing of barriers for FDI, moving more projects towards the private Iraqi sector. There are many big integrated companies in Iraq that they could do many of these projects, and they have the capital. They also can be supported through public-private partnerships, joint ventures, even if we have to go for the privatization of state-owned enterprises and so on. But that's on the mid to long term.
On the early elections, do we expect him to announce early elections?
Well, you see, there are two answers to this, Randa. There is the practical answer and there is the theoretical answer. The theoretical answer is the man came in and said, I will prepare for elections, meaning he will do 1 year. The practical answer, we are in a time of crisis. I don't think anybody can manage what's happening for 1 year. Even if we go now to the IMF, we go to lenders and we tell them we would like to borrow something, there will be lots of question marks. There will be lots of risk. Like, am I dealing with a prime minister that I'm going to see next year? Or am I dealing with someone who's just there, you know, for 12 months and then leaving? And this is the problem where we are here in Iraq. There is lots of uncertainty when it comes to that.
What will be the political cost if early elections are not held? I can get Yasar's point, but there are expectations. There is a wide segment of the population that expects early elections. Where do you come on this?
I think we need to put in mind that the government of Mr. Kadhimi is first, it's a crisis government. Second, it's 1 year or maximum 2 years government. So the expectations should be within those limitations. As a crisis government, I agree that the economic, the pandemic crisis is the first priorities for the government. But regarding the period of the government, this government, the expectations from this government is to make the basis for the next stage. It's very important mission for this government to prepare for the early election, the election law, the election commission, or other preparations. Also to organize the relation between the government and the armed groups. And also the organizing the relation between Iraq, or fixing the relation between Iraq and the international community, and especially the United States. So those things are basis for the next stage. For me personally, I don't expect an early election, yes, because of the pandemic, but also many political blocs, they don't find interest. They don't find they will do well in early elections. So they will try to push it as far as possible. Also the preparations, the role of the election commission, they are all new. They don't have enough experience, enough support. Election seems to be not a priority now within this crisis. So all those things need to more time, more funding, more preparation. So I don't expect that personally, I don't expect there will be an early election.
Okay, we have only about 12 minutes left, and there is an important topic that we have to address, which is the planned U.S. Iraq strategic dialogue, which is announced by Secretary Pompeo to be held in June under the leadership on the U.S. side of Undersecretary David Hale. I mean, and I have a bunch of questions here from the audience on this, and so let me just put it out there. And as I said to you in our preparation for this, there is a lot of writing about what the US wants to achieve, what should be the US objective. I think as Iraqis, as Iraqi experts, I would like to hear from you what Iraqis want to achieve, what Iraqis are expecting from this dialogue. And there is one question about how will the militias deal with this dialogue. What could be an outcome of the dialogues when it comes to U.S. armed presence? Will especially the militias accept, especially Iran-backed militias, accept continued military presence of U.S. forces as a result of this dialogue? And finally, there is a question on what will Iran do once this dialogue is launched? So Farhad, why don't we start with you? And then, of course, what I would like to hear from you personally is what are your recommendations for the agenda of this dialogue? Again, it's going to be brief. We have 12 minutes or less now, 11 minutes. So let's start with Farhad.
Okay. Just go back to the previous question. Adnan Zurfi's cabinet had 4 women, and Kadhimi must do the early election. He cannot He cannot avoid that. However, the logistics will take more than 1 year. As far as the Iraqis, what the Iraqis want for the strategic dialogue, I would say depend on which Iraqi you're talking about. The Kurds would like to see the Americans stay in one frame or another. I could say the same goes with the Sunnis. However, the opinion is divided within the Shia community. What the Iraqi government should do is really work out what is the best course of action for Iraqi security in terms of fighting ISIS and avoiding or preventing any external threat to the state. Iraq, as it stands now, cannot defend itself from any aggression from outside. And such aggression is a real threat, and it could exist, and it could happen. So it is something that they have to be practical about it. At the same time, they have to be realistic about it. The same goes with the United States, where they need to look at the intricate issues that the Iraqis are concerned about and how to really work it out. That would be the main objective, in my opinion. Any side wanting to force issues is not going to work. The United States, if it wants to force its will on the Iraqis, is not going to work. The other side also cannot push the United States out. A dialogue is the best way of going forward, and I believe that the State Department is preparing a delegation that will be heading to Iraq sometime soon to head start these negotiations and maybe have first few rounds of what could happen, and then they will take it from there. But one thing that the Iraqis need to know, if the Americans leave, they will leave the entire Iraq, rather than, there are some people talking about they might leave an enclave in Kurdistan or maybe have Ain al-Assad stay where it is. But in my opinion, and what I've been hearing from the Americans, they will leave the entire Iraq rather than just one particular aspect of it. So the Iraqis need to be pretty clear and pretty careful as what they should do and what they want and how to really go about in these negotiations.
And what about, Farhad, quick point, what about the other members of the coalition forces? If the US were to leave, we assume that the others will leave, correct?
From our discussions with them, if the US leave, absolute majority of them will leave. Save for a few of them that have direct relationship with Iraq, like the British. But I honestly cannot see that they will stay in terms of the training programs and all that, if they don't have a more comprehensive cover with the entire coalition partners. It is difficult for them to sustain any sort of presence while the big cover is gone.
Thank you. Hafsa, your take on this list of questions dealing with the US-Iraq strategic dialogue, upcoming one.
Thank you. I agree with everything that Kakfar had said. I'd also just add to that Mustafa Al-Kadhimi has been head of general intelligence for several years, and part of that role has been balancing these very intricate, delicate relationships and dealing with the fundamental question of US engagement and Iranian engagement. So it is unlikely that I personally, looking at the sort of plethora of actors that we do have at our disposal, shall we say, that anyone else is better placed to negotiate a balanced result on the security landscape from the strategic dialogue. And my recommendation really is to urge, the US-Iraq relationship, I find it to be quite unique across the region in the sense that very, very few other countries does the US lead and control all angles of development or security support to one particular country. And all the other countries, if you look at North Africa, you look at other parts of the region, the EU, other actors, they act to some extent independently, at least in terms of their economic cooperation, trading relationships, and so forth. Iraq is consumed internationally with the US relationship. So, if you're looking towards the fact that Iraq is not going to be privy to any Gulf support, if Gulf support to the region post-COVID is an option, it's going to look to the IMF, it's going to look to the international mechanisms that the US is going to be a big part of their support for. So part of the strategic dialogue has to focus on economic cooperation. And I think also looking at how the EU has incorporated parts of its association council agreements, things like digitization of government, improving the governance structures both locally and nationally, centrally, whether it's in the KRI or in Baghdad, and generally looking at different levers that it can use to utilize to actually begin to get this government to function to a level that prevents social unrest. And 10 seconds on the comment over Mustafa Al-Kadhimi and his government formation. Social unrest is going to be a mainstay of his government, however long, whether it's a post-pandemic a prediction of elections to be held in 21 that get pushed to 22, which would have been scheduled elections anyways, the most likely outcome. Even through the process, we still have to talk about electoral districts, how the female quota, the women's quota works into an independent candidacy system, et cetera, et cetera. So it will take time. Social unrest is going to be a mainstay of that, whatever happens. The question of the level of social unrest will be on the ability of the Prime Minister designate to keep the militias in line. Violent state-sponsored response to any unrest is going to create a vicious cycle where that grows and his position becomes untenable. So that's my take. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed, your take on the U.S. Iraq strategic dialogue and recommendations. Again, we have, I think, 4 minutes left, please, between you and Yasar.
Yeah, we need to remember that it's starting for strategic dialogue. It's not expected that this dialogue within this transitional period will lead to an agreement or a new agreement or many agreements, I don't know. But any strategic decision will not be taken by this government. Those decisions will be taken by the next parliament. This is very important. I think there are three positions toward this dialogue. First, I expect that the American expectation is to reorganize the American presence in Iraq and in dealing with the Iraqi government. This is what the Americans want. The armed groups want this dialogue, maybe, or expect from this dialogue to lead to expel the American forces from Iraq. But others, I think, among them, the new prime minister, they want to redefine the relation, especially in the security, in terms of security issues, the goals, the mission, the time, the priorities, all those things. Second, to focus on mainly on economic, cultural, political issues more than security issues, and that's what will be in the benefit of the two countries.
Thank you. Yasar, final word on this.
Thank you very much, Randa. So I'll try to be brief, which is not the case usually. I agree fully with Dr. Mohammed on who wants what, but let's keep in mind one thing. Let's be practical. You are talking about a U.S. government that is leaving in November, and the way COVID-19 is going and the pandemic, well, we don't know.
Yes, sir, we don't know.
We don't know, but so we have this challenge. So we have a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is being you have a U.S. government that is leaving, and you have an Iraqi government that is interim. And the U.S. government is focusing on short-term gains. I didn't have a chance to talk about the Iranian gas waivers, by the way, which was going to make this point. They're looking for short-term gains and looking at Iraq through the lens of maximum pressure on Iran. On the other hand, you have an Iraqi government that whatever decision they take, again, as Dr. Mohammed said, they have to go through the parliament, they have to take it to the next government. So this is the challenge. Now let's talk about the opportunity. The opportunity is we should be questioning why we are doing this in the first place. It's quite disappointing, to be honest, that Iraq and the US have to go into strategic dialogue again after, what, 17 years of losing people, trillions of dollars, and American soldiers, Iraqi civilians, and so on. And actually, this is one administration too late. We should have done that during the Obama days. And the opportunity from this, maybe this is the breaking point that we need in the relation between Iraq and the US to bring it back to a better outlook. I wish I could say more, but I know, Randa, you're done. So
thank you. At this, I mean, we have just like less than a minute left. Thank you very much, Farhad, Yasar, Hafsa, Muhammad. I personally found this conversation to be extremely interesting, insightful, and and I really appreciate Iraqi's perspectives, in terms of, especially when it comes to the U.S.-Iraq relationship, but also your perspective on what's going on inside the country, on what are the challenges facing the future governments, and just the future of Iraq itself. I mean, we have seen sensational, headlines of whether Iraq can hold it together, or it's going to fall apart. I come from that region. Countries do not fall apart easily, and there is resilience in communities and in societies to be able to face many challenges, including these humongous challenges facing them right now today. So at this point, I want to say that this is recorded for, you can all access this on the MEA website. And again, given the fact that the discussion barely touched on some of these issues, I promise our audience that we will have another opportunity with the panelists, hopefully in the future, if they agree to it, to delve deeper into some of these issues that were raised today. At this, thank you all. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thank you, Randa.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.